Olá! Eu entrevistei o professor Francis Fukuyama, da Universidade de Stanford, na Califórnia, nos Estados Unidos. A gente conversou sobre o governo Bolsonaro, sobre as eleições no ano que vem, sobre a tentativa do Bolsonaro de mudar o sistema de votação, a gente sabe por quê. Conversamos sobre as dificuldades da democracia brasileira, americana e da democracia no mundo como um todo. E ele é a pessoa para a gente ter essa conversa. O Fukuyama é um dos maiores especialistas no estudo das democracias no mundo, se tornou globalmente conhecido quando ele publicou primeiro um ensaio e depois um livro chamado O Fim da História, em que ele dizia que não havia modelo de desenvolvimento da humanidade superior ao modelo da democracia liberal e que com o fim do comunismo havia, de certa maneira, chegado ao fim da história. Essa, pelo menos, foi a forma que muitos entenderam o que o Fukuyama queria dizer. Ele diz que não era bem isso, mas é um tema que ele, ao longo da vida, sempre tem que voltar em suas entrevistas. Como eu já entrevistei ele algumas outras vezes, nessa aqui eu não tratei disso, tratei de temas mais atuais. Entre eles, o que cada um de nós, cidadãos brasileiros, precisamos fazer em nome da defesa da nossa democracia daqui até o ano que vem. E ele dá alguns conselhos. Vamos lá? Hey, Professor Fukuyama, thank you for your time. Thank you for being available for us. I'd like to start our conversation, of course, talking about President Bolsonaro. You probably saw that he's trying to change Brazil's electronic voting system, which has been in use for more than 20 years. And although there are not any signs or evidences of fraud, he's trying to make that. I'd like to know your opinion, to see to learn from your point of view about that.
It seems to me that President Bolsonaro has been copying Donald Trump in many, many respects. So he has copied him in his downplaying of the COVID pandemic, in recommending, hydrochloroquine, these remedies that don't really do anything, as panaceas for the disease. And he's now imitating, I think, the worst offense that Donald Trump committed, which was to try to illegitimate the electoral system altogether. Now, I obviously am not at all an expert on the Brazilian electoral system or how you actually administer elections, but I think that up till now there haven't been, really major complaints about the way that system was done. And it sounds to me very much like Bolsonaro is simply copying Trump. He doesn't want to leave power. He doesn't want to lose. And the easiest way to do that is to, in advance, argue that any election that he loses is going to be illegitimate and the result of fraud. And so I suspect that that's where he's coming from.
He wants more an argument to keep in charge than really make the process more transparent or more trustworthy.
Yes, that's really what Trump did, because he started saying that the election was going to be fraudulent several months before the election happened. This time last year, he was already saying that, the measures that were taken to allow citizens to vote safely, voting by mail or having drop-off boxes, were going to lead to massive fraud. And they didn't, but, he continued to make that charge after he lost the election. Of course, if he had won the election, you wouldn't have heard any of this kind of complaint.
Yeah. Last year in May, I asked you a commentary about the Brazilian crisis, and you told me that your greatest worry was that Bolsonaro whether Bolsonaro would call on the army to keep him in power as his popularity was sinking. You were in doubt, I remember, whether the army would want to take power under those circumstances, having to do with the pandemic and an economy that was collapsing. The situation is not very different now, but I'd like to check if you change your assumption about the military, specifically about the army.
Well, this is a question I should be asking you rather than you asking me. It does seem to me that in relatively recent memory, the Brazilian army did intervene in Brazilian politics in the 1960s. But I imagine that they didn't like that experience in the end. And, there's probably divided opinions. Bolsonaro has obviously appointed a lot of generals to positions of civilian authority. And they have some, reason to not want to give up those powers. But I also suspect that there's a significant part of the army that doesn't want the responsibility of running a big, complex country like Brazil again. And so I would think that is, one of the constraints that would operate, if any military leader is thinking about trying to support an illegal seizure of power.
Okay. How committed, Professor, do you think that the Brazilian armed forces seem to be with democracy?
Again, this is a question I would throw back at you because I don't have really the basis of information for, answering a question like that, unfortunately.
Okay. Considering the America pattern or the pattern of developed democracies, what are the limits of military in social media? What a commander-in-chief of the army or the navy or of what they can or cannot do in social media in terms of expressing politically or things like that?
Well, I think that any professional military would be better off not allowing its officers to express any kind of personal opinion on social media. In the United States, our military, the different commands have Twitter feeds and they post on Instagram. It's all kind of official business. There's going to be a big exercise and they want to notify people. So they talk about that sort of thing. To my knowledge, the US military does not allow any of its officers, and particularly senior officers, to have personal Twitter feeds where they can express opinions about, especially about politics. That's a norm that is reinforced by the Army's internal rules. I'm aware that a number of senior Brazilian generals, do participate in social media, and I think that's really something that should not be permitted.
Yes, in the last change that Bolsonaro made in the main positions of the army of the military, that he changed the 3 commanders-in-chief. He asked the new ones to have Twitter accounts, and they 3 now have, and they do not write political opinions, but at least one likes posts of Bolsonaro, political posts of Bolsonaro, political posts of his supporters, posts attacking the left, posts saying that COVID is the new communism, and so on. So this was the reason of my question, because it seems that it's not what we should expect of a commander-in-chief in social media, right?
Well, I think that it's very important for any liberal democracy to have a big wall of separation between the military and political authorities, including the commander-in-chief. And so, for example, Donald Trump wanted to use the military to put down internal demonstrations following on the murder of George Floyd by a police officer last summer. And it's very interesting. We now have read inside accounts of how the current chief of staff, General Milley, resisted those requests. He said that it really requires invocation of something called the Insurrection Act for the US military to be used. We have other instruments. We have National Guard units that are at the disposal of governors, and we obviously have police. And there's a very, very strong reluctance on the part of the senior military to get involved in any aspect of domestic politics. And that's, I think, a norm that is, important for maintaining the health of a democracy. And so I would think that a Brazilian military officer expressing opinion, it's one thing to obey a direct military command. So if Brazil is invaded by a foreign country, the commander, the president as a commander-in-chief, has a right to order the military to do things. But to seek political support for controversial decisions, I think should be completely off limits. And I don't think, any officer should be expected to do that.
Yeah. From your point of view, are Brazilian institutions like the Congress, the Supreme Court, the general prosecutor, are they succeeding in putting limits in holding Bolsonaro accountable?
Well, I think some of them have been trying to. So as I understand it, there are corruption cases that are being launched against, his family. But I think that he's also been trying, just like Trump did, to undermine the independence of all of those institutions by, selecting judges that will be favorable to him, replacing bureaucrats that aren't willing to do his bidding, and so forth. And again, all of this is eroding the kinds of institutional checks and balances that should exist in a properly functioning liberal democracy. A democracy does not give a president unlimited powers. It limits those powers in very clear-cut ways by, for example, giving authority to the legislature, by separating the bureaucracy and professionalizing it, by keeping the military in a separate professional channel. And to the extent that President Bolsonaro is trying to weaken all of these constraints, I think he's, playing a very dangerous game.
Yeah. What is the image of Bolsonaro nowadays abroad, Professor?
Well, I find it hard to find any large group of political leaders or opinion leaders who have a positive impression of him. To the extent that he was ever popular with anyone abroad, it was with Donald Trump and with politicians like Trump that saw a kind of like-minded populist leader in Bolsonaro. But now that Trump's gone, he certainly doesn't have any constituency in Washington that is particularly favorable to him. And I think it's even more the case in Europe, where I think that there's a almost universal consensus that he, is not an appropriate leader, that he's a danger to Brazilian democracy, and as such, really should be shunned as a international partner.
You said that he's a danger for democracy, and it's important to remember that in 2017, you included Bolsonaro in your class of democracy and the rule of law, democracy development and the rule of law, as a member of what you call the international populist. Yes. Yes. How do you see now that the Trump was defeated, after the defeat of Trump, how is going the plans of the international populist?
Well, I think the movement has been very much weakened by Trump's loss of the election. These populists are still hanging on in Hungary and Poland, but they've gotten a lot of pushback from the rest of Europe. I think in Latin America more broadly, I don't see anyone really trying to imitate Bolsonaro. I think the danger actually remains from left-wing populism. Castillo in Peru, and the potential return of Evo in Bolivia and so forth. So I think that the danger in your part of the world from this kind of right-wing populism is probably limited to the damage that Bolsonaro can actually do, in the remainder of his presidency. But I don't see it like a wildfire that's going to be spreading to a lot of other countries.
Yeah. In what extent the defeat of Trump last year affected Bolsonaro's plans, Professor?
I think that he, like many other people around the world, depended on American support. Being invited, to have dinner with the president gave him a lot of international recognition and prestige. And to that extent, I think it's helped him domestically in Brazil. Now that he's become a bit of an international pariah, I think he doesn't, he can't draw on that kind of foreign support. And in that respect, I think he's been weakened by it.
Yeah. You probably know that many candidates are trying now in Brazil to be the third way, to be the way that the person that will be able to defeat Bolsonaro and Lula next year. Do you see possibilities, concrete possibilities of flourishing of this name?
Well, look, I think the problem with what I would call liberal centrist candidates, and that means people that are not of the extreme left or the extreme right, their big problem has always been unity and the ability to work with each other. And in one country after another, that's been the big failure. In Europe, for example, the reason that Fidesz in Hungary and the PiS in Poland are still in power is that it's not that there's a lack of liberal alternatives, but there are many candidates and they don't really have a good way of cooperating so that they offer a united front with a very clear set of alternative policies. And I think that the Brazilian political system, unfortunately, promotes that kind of division because, you don't have a system like, let's say ranked choice voting, where you could come up with a single, candidate representing an important part of society. And so there's always been a great deal of fragmentation, both in presidential elections and especially in congressional elections, where no party has ever really been able to achieve a kind of commanding majority that would allow them to, make important decisions. So I would say that that's really the biggest obstacle standing in the way of a third way, between Lula and Bolsonaro. So
the question that I always have to make about Lula now, after a new plot twist in his life, now he's a free man. He can be part of the elections. What seems to be this Lula 2022 after almost 50 years in politics? How do you see this new Lula attempting to be president?
Well, look, I think that it's very important that the social groups that support Lula have representation. Brazil is a very unequal country. it suffered really from right-wing dictatorship and then, a right-wing populist, over time. And there need to be policies that, deal with some of the social inequalities that Brazil has. I'm not sure that Lula is the best person to represent that interest because, his record as president was tainted by corruption. I have no idea where he's at right now in terms of, the things that he's personally had to suffer and, undergo. But I think that, it's probably important that there be a new generation of leaders representing those social groups on the left that want that kind of change. Beyond that, I don't know Mr. Lula personally, and so I don't know what he would be like, his second time around as president.
Yeah, it's a mystery for many of us. It's not only you that are in the shadows.
If I could make one further comment,
please.
One of the things that's been happening in Latin America is that people are disgusted with the existing elites and they don't like any of the alternatives that are proposed, and they're willing to take a risk on new candidates that have really no experience in government. So Pedro Castillo in Peru is a prime example of that. He got less than 20% of the vote in the first round of the Peruvian election, and he won only because Keiko Fujimori was so unpopular in the second round. But, Peruvians are taking this enormous risk in voting for somebody like him because nobody knows what he stands for, really. He doesn't have a strong party in back of him. And there are reasons to really fear that he's going to either push Peru in a very left-wing direction that most people don't want, or he's simply going to be extremely weak and Peru will continue to be chaotic, and I think there are a number of other countries in the region that are moving in that direction. And so I do think it's important that people take political experience into account. If you've been a governor of a Brazilian state or the mayor of a major city or have some experience in governing, that's been a liability for many politicians, but it shouldn't be, because it's not that easy to govern a complex country. And I think that having that kind of governing experience should be a qualification rather than a disqualification for holding, the presidency or any other high office.
Yeah, we saw that in Brazil, not only with Bolsonaro, but also with governors and mayors, people that were elected because they had, for example, a good curriculum in private companies, but governments are totally different, right? It's not the same. And talking a little bit about one point that many times I remember from your last book. In 2018, you wrote in Identity, the Demand for Dignity and the Politics of Resentment. You talked about the power of identity politics driven by resentment to undermine a democracy. In the book, you don't mention a lot Brazil. I think that you just mentioned once. I'm not 100% sure. But do you think that these concepts that you wrote in Identity, it's also about Brazil or not?
Well, it could be. I have to say that I don't understand Brazilian society well enough to really be able to answer that question fully. But there are certainly groups that are underrepresented and not, recognized. A lot of them, are like Black Brazilians who have never really played the role in that society, in proportion to their their place in the broader society. The thing that I don't quite understand is the support base for Bolsonaro. In the United States, a lot of Trump support came from working class voters who had traditionally voted for the Democrats, for the left-wing party, but felt that the Democratic Party was now being controlled by well-educated, professional elites, and was no longer answering, their needs and demands. They promoted a globalization that really hurt their interest and, cost them jobs. In Brazil, that may be part of Bolsonaro's appeal, but socially, Brazil never had this huge middle class that all of a sudden was being thrown back into poverty. That's really the model that, I think has been driving populism in the United States and in Europe. But, Brazil never really achieved that, a comparable state. And so that's why I say that I don't quite understand, the social identity roots of Bolsonaro's election.
Yeah. Also, in identity, you wrote that democracy wouldn't survive if citizens did not believe they are part of the same polity. Is Biden succeeding in the task of making citizens believe in this unity again?
Well, he's made some efforts. It looks like he's going to be successful in passing a new big infrastructure bill, and he's getting, a substantial amount of Republican support for that. And if that bill goes through and they actually start building roads and bridges and so forth, he may succeed in convincing Americans that there actually is a common set of interests that they could pursue together. But on the other hand, 30% of the country and a majority of Republicans believe this false narrative that Donald Trump has put out, that he won the last election, but it was stolen from him because of fraud on the part of Democrats. It's a completely untrue, unsupported accusation. But, a lot of Republicans have been convinced that this is true. And if you believe that an election was stolen and that your president is illegitimate, that's not the basis for national unity. So until that issue is overcome, I don't think, Biden will be successful as a president that can somehow reunite the country.
So we would need 2, 3, 4 Bidens in terms of time.
Yeah, and I think what you need and what I'm hoping will happen with the Republican Party is that they're not going to continue to win elections looking backwards and complaining about, how they were cheated and so forth. They need to present a positive scenario for what they would do if they were to take power again. And since they don't have that, it's possible that the Democrats will eventually simply overpower them, among voters. And that's the way the polarization will end. But unfortunately, we're not there yet. And the Republicans could easily take back, the House of Representatives in 2022, and conceivably they could win the presidency again in 2024. So if that happens, I think we're still going to be in a situation of considerable polarization.
Yeah. Well, Professor, where does this conspiracy theory-driven populism lead ultimately? Does it continue like that into the future, or is there a limit for it?
The limit to any conspiracy theory is reality. And so, you've probably read about this QAnon conspiracy that's very popular in certain parts of the American right, where they believe that the Democrats are pedophiles that are, secretly eating children and things of this sort. And they've made repeated predictions, that Trump would win the election, that Trump would become president on January 20th, that he's going to be reinstated sometime this summer, and none of these prove true. And I think that there's a weird psychology of people that want to believe in conspiracy theories, where even the most obvious evidence that they're wrong isn't enough to shake them out of their belief. But I think that if it happens over and over again, that eventually, people will stop paying attention. And so I think that's really the only hope we have. The problem is that these conspiracy theories have been supported by an internet that really has no filters. And so if you, raise a question, did Trump win the election in 2020? You'll get 10,000 hits, if you do a Google search of people saying, yes, he did win the election. And that's a situation that didn't really exist, 20 years ago, before the rise of the internet and the rise of social media.
Yeah. You told me once that democracy needs to be defended, and people many times they think that this defense is natural and it doesn't need our effort. What suggestions, what kind of advice would you give for people that have the challenge that we have next year here in Brazil, for citizens?
Well, I think that's pretty straightforward. People need to be mobilized. So if you want to defend democracy, you have to work together with other people that also want to defend it. At a minimum, that means going out and voting, right? And I think there are many groups that would defend democracy in theory, but they just don't bother to vote. And that's especially true of young people who vote in much lower numbers than older ones. But beyond just voting, there's plenty of political activism that you can engage in, to support candidates that support your ideas, that, you can write, you can promote the idea of democracy in whatever, context you're operating in. And that's the work of politics. Politics doesn't happen unless people want to use it to bring about change. In the United States, in the 2020 election, there was actually a massive mobilization of people that didn't like Donald Trump. And so the numbers of people that voted, actually on both sides, but especially for Biden, were just enormous. About 80 million people, more than 80 million people voted for Biden, which was the largest number by far of any election in American history. And so, I think that it requires that kind of effort of getting out the vote and convincing people to take the time to express their political views by voting. That's really how you ultimately get power in a democracy, and therefore can stop bad things like the spread of populism.
Yeah. Frank, thank you very much for your time again. And
Sure.
I hope that in our next conversation, things are better here.
I hope so too.